So I did it. I figured out a way to capture rust on my Razer Blade so that I can make this benchmark video. If you watched my last benchmark, you'll know that I meant for it to be rust instead of arc, but I had issues capturing on the laptop. So long story short, I used my desktop computer capture card, so the Elgato HD60 Pro that I just got, as my capture device, set the input as my laptop, and the output to an external monitor screen that my laptop could then be projected to. So if the video does look a little less clear than normal, it's probably because normally when I capture these benchmark videos on my laptop, I do it natively with its own software. But instead, this video is being captured remotely. Anyway, the short story for Rust is, yes, laptop plays the game great on most settings that I tested, but I will have some suggestions, and I noticed some FPS drops on some of the settings more than others. There are 5 default graphical settings for Rust that you can choose from when starting up the game, but I decided to just test 3 because 5 is a lot. So I went through fastest, good, and fantastic for both 720 and 1080p resolutions. And so it's basically a low, medium, high that I normally do for video games. And then since you have the other 2 or 3, you can infer those settings that are in between there based on the results that I found through these low, medium, high tests. Starting off with 720p resolution set to the graphical setting of fastest, you should see an average FPS of around 77. My game only dipped to about 61, but reaching upwards of 90 frames per second, but the average was closer to high 70s, low 80s. With the low not going under 60 frames, I love that, but of course it is a really low resolution. Well, it's not really low resolution. It's 3/4 resolution of what you would normally play at 1080p, but it's also the lowest graphical settings possible. So I will say that setting it to fastest, the game is still really beautiful, but these are, frames that I should expect from the lowest test. The temperatures were nice too. The CPU and GPU only reaching to the mid 80s, so that's pretty cool compared to some of the other games that we've tested on the channel. Moving on to good settings at 720p, the game reached a low of 45, so that's a bit of a dip from the last test, but still a high of 80 frames per second. And you're averaging 65 to 67 frames per second, so that's still a very good average that you're playing on. The graphical settings is higher, obviously, so there is some impact to performance, but overall, it's pretty solid. You will notice some of those FPS drops while you're running through grass or forest, and I think that's actually just an artifact of the game because you see this throughout most of my tests. Temperatures were still pretty solid here. CPU sticking to the mid 80s range, and spoiler alert, we're going to see that a lot. And the GPU going as high as 88 degrees Celsius, but still it's not that danger zone. Most games that we've tested on the channel, GPU stuck closer to 90 degrees pretty consistently. Finally, testing fantastic graphical settings at 720p, we see the game dip below 60 frames per second, averaging around 52, reaching a high of about 59 and a low of 28 for my test. I think a lot of those 28 FPS drops was either running or using the hatchet on a tree that are part of those artifacts that I was talking about before. That's part of the game though, so that's something that needs to be taken into account. Even if it's like an artifact dip, it's still a dip. And the average is still set, I've set it to 52 because of those random drops. That's why the average is so much higher than the low. This setting is still playable and you still get the max graphical settings, but if you want to have a consistent above 60 FPS limit, then you want to look elsewhere or tweak these default settings a little bit. Temperature-wise, we were looking exactly the same. CPU stuck to the mid-80s range, and then the GPU was hitting about 89, 90, so a little bit hotter, but not bad. It's still pretty much the same. I've seen the CPU go much hotter in games. We've seen them go all the way up to 97, 98 degrees Celsius. So I don't think this is actually a hardware throttle since the CPU is not that hot. I think this is actually just the case for Rust. It may not be CPU intensive, or it's just what it can perform at that level. So changing resolution to 1080p, we're going back to look at the fastest graphical settings, so the low settings. I was hoping to get a little more out of this than what we got, but you're only averaging about 42 frames per second with a high of 52 and a low of 36. It kind of gives you a hint that this game doesn't run super great at 1080p. It's doable, but it's not nearly as good as 720p, which you'd imagine, but I thought they'd be a little bit closer. Temperatures for the CPU were actually lower, reaching low 80s, but the GPU stayed at the high 80s, nearly 90 degrees. Continuing this downward trend though to good settings, I had an average FPS of about 34 with my low hitting 31 and high hitting only 44 frames per second. The average is closer to the low because it would peak at times closer to 44, but it wouldn't sustain that limit. Rust is a survival game, so not like first-person twitchy shooter. There is shooting involved, don't get me wrong, but it's not like Call of Duty or anything like that. So you could play these type of games at lower frames, but I don't know why you would want to. Temperatures again continued as the story for almost all of these tests, CPU sticking to the low to mid 80s and the GPU at the high 80s, 80 degrees again. And lastly, my final test, fantastic settings at 1080p. Just don't play it. That's my sum up, but turn your settings up if you see like an awesome area that you want a cool screenshot, like the sun's reflecting off the water or something like that, and then turn the settings back down afterwards. Because standing still, I was getting my max FPS of 41 frames, but I averaged closer to 30 frames per second with a low hitting to 23. Like I said previously, some people might be fine playing at 30 FPS, but the view of the prettiness with the 1080p resolution just isn't worth it for me. Temperatures were completely fine, so like I said, I don't think this is a hardware throttle. I think it's just the limitation of the game with the actual hardware. It's not a throttle based on temperatures, it's just what it can perform at these settings. CPU only spiking once or twice above the mid-80s threshold, as well as the GPU sticking to that high 80s that we've been seeing throughout the test. Like I said, I don't think like in previous tests, I think the temperatures of the hardware was getting too hot and it throttled the game back. I think this is actually just what it can perform without any type of temperature throttling involved. Overall, like I said though, the game runs really well on the Razer Blade. For me, I suggest playing at 720p resolution because you can actually see things a little bit better because the 14-inch screen can be a little small, like I've said in previous tests, and you're consistently getting above 60 frames per second on most settings. What I personally would use is 720p resolution and picking either good settings or in between good and fantastic. You do see a general decline as you bump up the graphics like you would expect, but at 1080p resolution, that decline is pretty drastic, and I'm not sure it's worth the sacrifice to quality just to have that higher resolution. Those are just my 2 cents. But anyways, guys, please let me know in the comments if you have any more suggestions for future games. I think I'm going to be doing Overwatch next, and I'm going to be out of town for work this coming week, so expect a delay in some videos. It's just, there's nothing I can do about it except make as many as I can before I leave, and that's basically what I'm doing right now. So, as always, I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope your day is beer and Skittles.